This week at the Philos Project, we have some news. Our founder, Robert Nicholson, stepped down from his active role at Philos as the director. And Luke Moon, our deputy director, who's been with Robert since the beginning of its founding 10 years ago, has stepped up into the leadership role. So we will have Luke Moon on the podcast this week, and we're excited to have you, Luke.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. I'm excited to have you as we talk about the UN and UNRWA. You do a lot of our activism here at Philos. So you've protested in front of the Secretary General's house that went viral on Instagram. And you've also just worked, even before your time at Philos, in this space where the UN also occupies. So I just excited to hear your personal perspective on that. But first, I just want to bring
I have a lot of very strong opinions about this matter.
About it?
Yes.
Well, we can't wait to hear about it. I'm just going to bring our audience up to speed onto some of the news surrounding UNRWA. So back in January, Israel put forth a document outlining the corruption and bias that's really systemic in UNRWA. And the report cited that there was at least 12 UNRWA employees who were actively participating in the October 7th attack. And the report further alleged that 1,500 employees have active ties to the terror group. UNRWA employs roughly 30,000 employees, most of them being Palestinian. After the report came out, UNRWA did release or dismiss at least 9 employees. And the report resulted in numerous Western countries, including the US, freezing their funding for UNRWA, which was significant because the United States and the European Commission essentially bankroll UNRWA. And then in current news this week, there was an interim report released by an independent review at the UN into those initial allegations made by Israel in January. And the report found, maybe unsurprisingly, that the Relief Agency for Palestinian Refugees has mechanisms in place to ensure neutrality, but there's also deficiencies that must be addressed. They were very vague on what those deficiencies might be. And so next week, or towards the end of the month, the panel will develop a final report with recommendations for how to address these issues in UNRWA, but they did not come out and affirm what Israel had put forth in their initial report, which is not surprising. So Luke, help us understand what UNRWA is, how it's different from the High Commission for Refugees at the UN, and what their role is in Gazan society on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, the UNRWA stands for UN Relief Works Agency, and it was founded really at the founding of the State of Israel. As the war started between Israel and the 5 surrounding nations. As a result of that, there was a lot of refugees created, particularly Arab refugees. They didn't self-identify as Palestinian at the time, and UNRWA basically took charge of that specific group of people, and it was actually created separate from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which handles the rest of the refugees around the world. So there are 2 basically refugee bodies in the United Nations, one that handles every country in the world, and then one that handles Palestinians. And the Palestinian one has some very unique characteristics of it. One major characteristic is that Palestinian refugees that were refugees in 1948 or 1967, whatever, their children and grandchildren are also receive receive refugee status as well.
And that's unique to the other definition at the UN of refugee, in that you can't inherit that status. And also, it's my understanding that UNRWA, you can inherit that status through a male ancestor, even if you have citizenship outside of the Palestinian territories, which is, of course, then a multiplying definition of refugees. So just for an analogy for our audience, my grandparents are from Cuba, but I'm not a Cuban refugee because I was born in the United States to a mother born in the United States. And so I don't inherit that status. Whereas for Palestinians outside of the territory, they still carry that. So it's a multiplying effect. So there's roughly, how many refugees, do you know, Luke, at the moment does UNRWA claim are living outside of?
Oh, it's millions and millions. I don't off the top of my head know how many, but it's I think over 5 million actually. Maybe even more than that, but it's a lot. Um, and to put it in perspective, also there are something in the range of I read recently in 2022 108 million people who had some kind of refugee status, meaning internally displaced people or people that were considered, you know, had received some kind of refugee status by the United Nations, right? So there's different kinds of refugees, but you know, back in the day, before I was with the Philos Project, I I worked as a missionary, and I was in Asia a lot, and I worked briefly uh, at a refugee camp in Thailand for Bhutanese refugees, people from Bhutan, because the country of Bhutan had done an ethnic cleansing. If you could not prove your family's uh, legacy in the country of Bhutan back 7 generations, you were kicked out. If you were converted to any other religion other than Bhutanese Buddhism, you were kicked out. So it was, and you know, those eventually that refugee camp that I worked at was closed down, and those refugees were kind of scattered all across the world. Handled their status was turned into these people became citizens of various countries around the world, United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia, etc. And they are they're kind of moved off the rolls, which is another big distinction between UNHCR and UNRWA, is that you know the UNRWA numbers continue to grow year after year, and everybody else, you know, becomes citizens of various countries, and they're moved off the rolls.
Mhm. And I just want to revisit the stat when I had asked you how many. I know it was 2019, they said there was about 5.9 million, but I'm sure, as we've mentioned, those numbers have since um, multiplied. And so, Luke, what role does UNRWA play in society within Gaza? So I know it's presented as a strictly humanitarian body of the UN, but it's to my understanding that it really makes up a lot of the infrastructure in Gaza. As we know, Hamas really is a weak or failed state. So, what is their interaction with people on a daily basis? I know they run schools, they have a role in the hospitals. So, how would a Palestinian interact with UNRWA in their daily lives?
Well, because there's a lot of UNRWA refugees in Gaza, a lot of the basic social services. We're talking about uh, the school system. We're talking about, as you mentioned, the medical system, but also like a lot of food services, like you know, nutritional services. They get bags of rice or flour. They get oil. They get that kind of basic necessity, and you know, we used to have a staff member who worked with us who grew up in Gaza and grew up at a school, an UNRWA school in Gaza, and all of his teachers were part of UNRWA, and a bunch of them were supporters of Hamas. And so it was even at the you know, back when he was going to school, it was that way, and he was actually had to flee because he was accused by his by classmates of blasphemy, and had to leave school as a result. And so that's kind of, unfortunately, the reality of you know the fact that Gaza, there are only like what 700 or 800 Christians in the whole country. Everybody else is Muslim, and everybody else is specifically Sunni Muslim. And so it's the most homogenous place probably in the whole world. And as a result, like it just, if you're not one of them, then you're like they really persecute you, and that was the experience of our friend.
And so the international community, largely supports UNRWA. They view them as a purely humanitarian body, and turn a blind eye to their complicit role with Hamas or their ties to Hamas, or even the role they play to help Hamas in providing this essential infrastructure that they fail to in Gaza. So, how does this international support highlight just the underlying biases in the UN against Israel? We can even talk about other bodies outside of UNRWA. But what's your experience been? And in your activism, what are things you've protested happening at the UN?
Well, I mean, it's the UN is like an octopus with a lot of tentacles. So it has a lot of kind of agencies in addition to UNRWA. There's the UN Women, and there's people dealing with children and population, and et cetera, et cetera, all of which have been involved in the United Nations. But there is a bias in general at international bodies, most of them. A lot of human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, uh, as we have seen with groups like the International Court of Justice, these international institutions, a lot of them have real anti-Israel bias and have had that for from almost the very beginning. Um, they there's a lot of influence from as these organizations they cross pollinate, right? So it's not uncommon to have an employee go from a big human rights organization to going to work at the United Nations and then go on to work at another NGO, and like they kind of all cross pollinate, and in that there's a lot of there's just a lot of bias against Israel, against the Jewish people, that manifests itself throughout these international institutions. And I think I think there's a spiritual dimension to this. A lot of the people, in these organizations are not Christian. They're not Jewish. If they are Jewish, racially or ethnically, they're not practicing. Um, and the in a lot of ways, I would say that the church has a different view of its role in society than the UN does. It's the UN kind of moving towards seeing themselves as really the arbiter of all things global, and sees potentially the church as competition for that. And when someone is looking at the church, they're also looking at the Bible, the people of the Bible, and that's where they bump into Israel and the Jewish people. So I tend to think that there is this underlying spiritual dimension to a lot of this stuff, and I think it comes down to um, this irrational hatred of the Jewish people, rooted in the fact that the people by which God brought His moral revelation into this world, I think the world hates Him for it, and it doesn't want that moral revelation. And yet they use the moral revelation, right? Because like at the UN itself, down the street from us in our office, they like literally has Bible verses from Isaiah on the walls, but it's in no way is affirming of what the essence of the people who brought those Bible verses into this world.
That's amazing insight. I think it's important to talk about the unforeseen things and mechanisms at play as well. In closing, Luke, what do you think UNRWA's role, if you could predict in the future, in the next few months, will be in Gaza? I know Israel's said that they're not wanting to work with UNRWA because of these systemic either biases against Israel or their lack of cooperation or their ties to Hamas. So, what does a future, I mean, this is a big loaded question, but what would a potential future in Gaza look like? And do you think UNRWA is going to continue to play an important role? Or was this report by Israel in January really kind of the nail in the coffin as far as the effectiveness of this agency?
Well, the United Nations provides the bulk of funding for UNRWA. And in the last big continuing resolution that funded the U.S. government for another period of time, there was actually provision in there that banned the financial support of UNRWA from the United States. And so, imagine your budget suddenly gets cut, your personal budget gets cut by three quarters. You might, there might be some challenges to your ability to do things. I think there is. I don't. the dream scenario is that UNRWA gets dissolved and all of the services that UNRWA provided would be provided by the UN High Commission for Refugees, and then the whole UN, the UNRWA infrastructure that's providing services beyond Gaza in the West Bank, in Lebanon, Jordan, etc. All that would get dispersed, and services would be provided by those nations directly, as opposed to being done through the UN, and eventually those people would be no longer a part of that. So it's kind of the idea. It's my hope, but I don't know. We'll see. I'm hopeful that there will be some big changes. I'm doubtful that there will be big enough changes that it completely does away with UNRWA as an institution.
Well, thank you so much for this really important insight, Luke. This is just really valuable information as we just see the war progress and then also examine UNRWA's role. For our audience that wants to follow your projects, I know you've had some really big projects recently, your speaking engagements, your writings, where can they follow you on social media?
Well, I'm on X, formerly Twitter, at Luke Moon One. I couldn't get Luke Moon, so I'm Luke Moon One. And then probably the next thing is we're in Israel together, Dominique, with the Philos Leadership Institute crew, and so that would be really fun. And that's the next big thing.
Yes, and we're really excited. So when we're on the ground, I'll be interviewing a lot of people we're speaking with. Luke will be there, so he'll be part of this interview process. And then my coworker, Isaac Woodward, who leads PLI, our Philos Leadership Institute, will also be on the ground, as well as Josefa Gonzalez, who is our communications director. So we'll have a whole host of us in Israel bringing you guys narratives from the ground. So we're really looking forward to it. Thank you very much for coming on, Luke, and I'm excited to have you back on in the following weeks.
Thank you.